Hola, and welcome to Vive Nutrition Radio, the first ever Spanglish podcast where you will hear interviews with the top minds in nutrition, performance, fitness, and health in both English and Spanish. Here is your host, expert registered dietitian, Andres Ayesta, on a mission to help you take your nutrition to the next level. Hope you're ready for this. Let's dive right in.
What is going on, family of iTunes, Google Play, and all platforms listening to this podcast or possibly YouTube? Thank you for tuning in on another week and another episode of Vive Nutrition Radio. Today's episode is straight up fire as usual, but there's always specific guests that I bring into the podcast that I have admired for a long time, and this is no exception. My guest today, his name is Will Grazione. Or I don't even know if I say his name right. Will Grazione. Obviously an Italian last name. But Will is one of the most recognized figures in the nutrition coaching world. He has helped prepare hundreds, if not thousands of people for physique shows, bodybuilding competitions, and now works actually a lot with general population in trying to improve their body composition using science to be able to accomplish this through flexible nutrition programming and using advanced strategies that, this is the kind of stuff that has been talked about very rarely since maybe earlier 2010, 2015, anywhere between that, when people didn't even know what a refeed or a diet break or things of that sort, reverse dieting existed. These guys were the ones talking about it and nobody else was. And now it's a trendy topic and everybody's chatting about this reverse dieting concepts and all these different things. And here's Will saying hey, I've been talking about this for years now. But Will's definitely a very interesting guy. He definitely applies a lot of the research into his own clients, and he creates what he likes to call, obviously, case studies. And today's conversation revolved around the concept of diet breaks, specifically because that is what what I've seen a lot of the content he puts out, which is amazing, by the way. And I'm going to link up all the stuff that you can actually check out on the show notes. But today we had a conversation about diet breaks. We went on some tangents, but obviously really impactful and valuable information. So, but of course he said his story at the beginning and how he became a nutrition coach and how he built this business, which is really, really interesting. So whether you're a client or a person trying to improve your nutrition, or you are a nutrition coach or dietitian listening to this is going to be extremely helpful because it applies to both. In fact, he asked me the question, who listens to this podcast the most? And I said it's a combination of nutrition coaches, dietitians, and nutrition professionals, but also people that are trying to improve their nutrition. So definitely you need to make sure that you give it a listen to this one because you're going to get a lot of gems out of it and you're going to enjoy it. Also, we talked about his 96-hour fasting experiment. He fasted for 4 days. Of course, you guys know that I'm a proponent of fasting methods in some specific scenarios. And he talked about his experience and really what he did. Of course, this is a fair warning and a preface just to ensure that you don't go out there and do a 4-day fast without medical supervision. I'm going to repeat it. You don't go out and do a 4-day fast without medical supervision or knowing or with the help with a professional. So I just want to make sure that I made that super clear before we even started the podcast. But anyways, I'll let you to listen to this conversation with Will. And like I said, we went over dietary compliance, diet breaks, and things of that sort. And it was really, really, really exciting to have him on the podcast. And hopefully we'll bring it back up again so we can talk about other topics and other conversations in this regard. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode with Will Grazione, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Take care. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Vive Nutrition Radio. I have the pleasure, as I mentioned in the intro, to have William Grazione to be here on the podcast. Will, what's going on, man? How are you today?
What's going on, Andres? Man, it is an absolute pleasure to be on here. I'm going to get you and me on my Instagram story.
Oh, dude, yeah, I got to do the double flex, huh?
And, dude, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to have an awesome conversation, and I appreciate you reaching out and connecting with me, and I'm excited to have this episode.
Yeah, man. So why don't we start from the beginning? I always like to hear people's stories, kind of like their 30-second elevator speech, but you can extend past the 30 seconds. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about where this entire passion for fitness and nutrition and all this started for you?
Man, it's definitely going to take me longer than half a minute to do that. But you know what, man? In all seriousness, when I tell people I started lifting weights when I was 6, most people don't believe it, But my uncle he was very adamant on kind of pushing me into the direction of being like a bigger, stronger version of who I already was, And he was a big, strong guy. And I remember when I was 6 years old, and it was for my 6th birthday, he got me a weight set. And it was a very short, little hollow barbell and some cement plastic coated weights. And the first time I got a pump, I was 6 years old. And ever since then, I was like, man, like I really enjoyed it because I had a lot of, and this could go pretty deep, but I had a lot of internal anger from my childhood and stuff like that I didn't have the opportunity to really take that out on anything or anybody without getting in trouble, right? So for me, the weights was just a way for me to release energy, And from the time I was 6 up until the time I got into like middle school, I had been lifting weights. So naturally, kind of when I got into athletics and I started playing football when I was 12 years old, I was already, bigger, stronger, and faster than all the other kids. And that definitely helped me out because I felt like I had a head start. You know what I mean? And from that time playing football in athletics, being strong, that basically just helped me realize that the confidence that I was able to grow in becoming stronger, in becoming more physically active, in feeling like I was dominant on the football field, the actions that I did, being disciplined with resistance training, basically carried over into every facet of my life now as an adult, right? So I played football from the time I was 12 all the way through graduating from college. And after graduating from college, I was like, man, what's the next thing? And I was always infatuated with, physique enhancement, building muscle, losing body fat. So I got my major in exercise science. And I believe it might have been when I was in high school. I was at a bodybuilding gym, and it was called the Pumping Station on 4th Street in
the Pumping Station. I love
Dude,
that.
It was complete bro gym, man. Every guy in there was jacked. First time I ever seen a guy bench like 500 pounds, it was in there. First time I ever seen a guy squat 500, it was in there. And these guys were all like big, huge bodybuilders. And one day I'm in there lifting. I think I was like 14 years old. And this was the first time anybody had ever saw something in me regarding bodybuilding that I had ever seen in myself, right? And he walks over to me and he's like, hey, man, he's like, you ever thought about being a bodybuilder? And I was like, man, I'm a football player. I don't got time to do bodybuilding. And this was like a bodybuilding champion who had just came out of winning a show, I think maybe a week prior to that. And so I just kind of shut the idea down. I continued playing football. And naturally, once I was done playing football in college, I needed something to fulfill that competitive nature, And I started doing some research, stumbled upon natural bodybuilding through the likes of Dave Gooden, Dr. Joe Klemczewski, Lane Orton, and the research that they were kind of putting out and the things that they were talking about, to me, from a metabolic standpoint, it made sense. And I realized that all of the stuff that I was hearing about regarding bodybuilding in my local gyms and, all the stuff I was reading in Flex magazine and all of that stuff, it wasn't true. There was no evidence to support the claims that a lot of these people were making, specifically during things like peak week, the optimal way to lose body fat, so on and so forth. So I gravitated towards the content that Dave, Joe, and Lane were putting out. And I think that was like 2009, 2010. And from that point, I started bodybuilding. I prepped myself for my very first show, utilizing all the information that I had learned from them, and I won the overall. And once I won the overall at my very first show, you could say that the bug hit me, and I was like, man, I can be a professional. I can be better. I can always do better. And that kind of started my path into, being a bodybuilder and then ultimately becoming a coach. I guess you could say my goal when I graduated was to actually become a physical therapist. But once I realized the impact that I could have with people that were just in my gym, going into physical therapy school at the time just didn't make sense.
Yeah.
Because that's when, you know, I started to become a champion. I started to win every show I was in, and people started to take notice of that and asking me for help. So it all started with just leading by example. And then people were asking me questions, and then it's up to me to provide value.
Yeah.
Right. So interestingly enough, like when I started this whole coaching thing, I was working as the janitor at Gold's Gym in Saint Petersburg, Florida.
Really?
So I was the guy with the vacuum pack on his back, vacuuming up the floors, cleaning the machines, fixing the machines, cleaning the bathrooms. That guy was me. And what I ended up noticing was that these clients of the personal trainers that were in the gym were asking the personal trainers questions. And I was always in there. So I always heard the question.
Yeah. Observing.
I was always observing. I was always listening. Cause I'm like, man, these are trainers. Like they must be of this like prestigious thing to where I didn't at the time feel like I was capable of doing that. Maybe it's because I'm a perfectionist, or maybe it's because I focus on the very minute details of things, but I would listen to these responses. And I was like, man, the trainer's full of shit. Like, that's not right. You know, that's not factual. Like, there's no evidence to support that. So then what I would do is I would go home after I got off shift, and I would research, and I would research, and I'd research for hours, locking myself in the room, just researching for hours until I would find the answer. And the next day I'd go into the gym and I'd find that same person. I said, I know yesterday your trainer wasn't capable to answer your question in a manner that you may have understood. So let me go ahead and explain what I have found. And over the course of time, what essentially happened was that people started coming up to the janitor asking me for help. Right. So then I'm like, all right, what's going on here? Like why, like people are asking me. And the thing is that I just showed up to solve the problem, man, you know? And that was what I did time over and time over until I finally got the belief in myself to just walk straight up to the GM of the gym and say, hey, I know I can be the best trainer in this gym. I just need the opportunity. And pretty much after I gave him an elevator speech for like a minute, he asked me, when can I start? And I started as a personal trainer then, and then pretty much outgrew the gym. And I saw the opportunity for online coaching in 2010. And I pretty much took that and I ran with it.
Damn, man. And you've done, like, the thing about you is like, you've been doing this like something that now it's like a trend, you know, like, because I feel like
it's
online
cool
coaching, and it's a cool thing for people to do. I mean, us like dietitians, we never like even thought about in schooling, like, hey, you could do this thing online. No, like when we're in school, you're taught like you need to do a consult, you need to do a full assessment, you need to do like a diagnosis, and obviously create some sort of like a path or obviously some intervention that you have to establish for like the patient. And every time like you would call them patients, but never it was actually being talked about, and the whole fact of like, you know, you can coach people. Like coaching was not necessarily a term being used even in school. And now obviously you see a lot of people that were like, you know, trying to, like you obviously since the very beginning, starting this entire, not even a trend, it's just essentially the way that it should be done from the beginning, which is obviously kind of coaching people at that point. So, and this goes back to, you said 2010.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was my first competition season, was 2010. And to be honest with you, I didn't know coaching was a thing either, you know, until 2010, when again, I started bodybuilding, and I'm going to these shows and I'm looking around and I'm like, why do these bodybuilders have guys that are like standing next to them, you know, and like, they're like helping them out, you know? And I was like, maybe what are they like? It's a bodybuilding coach. Like, I didn't even know a bodybuilding coach was a real thing. Yeah. And, you know, upon kind of learning more about Dr. Joe and learning more about Lane, I realized that they were actually coaches. At that moment in time, I didn't know they were coaches. I just thought they had something to do with evidence of like doing lab work and like all of that stuff, maybe working for a university or something. I didn't know they were actually bodybuilding coaches. And, so from that moment, I realized like this was actually something that I could do. And interestingly enough, man, I didn't charge anybody for like a year and a half. So I had worked with like over 20 clients in my first 18 months. And I turned, I think, 4 people pro in my first 18 months of coaching clients.
For free?
Yeah, absolutely free. I didn't charge anybody anything. And at the time, I was struggling hard, man. You know, I was working 3 different jobs. I was a janitor. I was working as a martial arts instructor. And I was also working as a janitor at another location as well. And then doing some very like small time personal training work on the side.
Yeah.
So I didn't even know that I had the opportunity to make money doing it. I was just providing a service because I'm like, man, I just love this so much. Like being able to utilize like evidence-based practices that I know of and transform people's bodies and like, you know, really get them to achieve the goals that they've always wanted their entire life. That just filled me up with so much happiness and so much joy that I didn't even think about asking for any money.
Yeah.
And then I think it was probably 18 months in, and I realized I'm like, man, I'm really helping these people. And I remember going into the gym one day and I asked a client of mine, you know, if he would mind paying me $100 a month. And he goes, dude, you changed my whole life. He's like, I'll pay you. He's like, I'll pay you whatever you want. And I was like, what about the other 17 people or, you know, 15 people I'm working with? So that's kind of how the idea was sparked. You know what I mean?
As a business,
as an actual business. So I basically, you know, went full time with online coaching, but it was really hard to quit all of the 3 or 4 jobs that I was working because that was like the stability that I think a lot of people they're groomed to search for, right? It's like you're groomed to search for stability. You're groomed to say, I'm going to graduate from college with my degree. I'm going to get out and I'm going to make X amount of money every year.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that was my mindset, was like, that was my safety blanket. And when I decided to quit all my jobs at the time, I had just gotten in a relationship with my wife, Tanya, and she was working a full-time job. And I approached her with the idea. And, you know, once we started to see some cash come in, she was like, I will support you. Right. She was like, I got this. And, you know, I needed about a month before the cash kind of started coming in and I was actually holding my weight. And it wasn't anything but maybe 6 weeks after I had quit all my jobs that I was making equal amount of money that I was making working all 4 jobs. And then, you know, within the first year, I tripled that and then I quadrupled it and then it just kept on climbing. So
that's good, man. Which is like where you're at today, right? I mean, you're obviously kind of have a successful business owner and then helping like, you know, hundreds of people achieve their nutrition goals, which obviously leads to like the part of that. Let's get into like the nutrition nitty gritty details of science and stuff like that, because I want to ask you a bunch of stuff about this because one of the bigger things that people know you a lot about you is you've been talking about these concepts that are now trendy. One of them being diet breaks. And I have talked about this stuff in the podcast before, and people like a lot of times like they ask me about this, like what is a diet break and what is it really, why is it implementing or what do people should actually go for it? And I know like one of the first, like I think you posted about it the other day, like, you know, on YouTube, like you posted a video back in 2015 when people didn't even know what a diet break was. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about this, how you implement this with your clients and really what is a diet break and how do you kind of like use it?
Sure. So let me ask you a question real quick, Andres. Is the majority of your audience, is the majority of your audience more so like a client searching for information, or are they more so a coach searching for coaching information?
So there's a mix. So there's a lot of dietitians that listen to this. And I'm sure that they're like, yeah, we want to know how you do it. And then obviously there's a lot of people that are also, they want to know the science so they can kind of apply it to themselves. So there's like a little mix of everything. So maybe with that in mind, you can actually answer that question. Okay,
cool. Yeah. So, well, I guess it was 2013, and obviously I had already been coaching for numerous years already, and there's something about me to where I'm sure you can realize that like in the evidence-based space, there are some people who are completely shut off to ideas that have not yet been proven by science, right? And if it's not been proven by science, they're like, I'm never going to use that. It's not in my arsenal. I've always been very open-minded though, because I've always believed that the application and who it actually applies to is really where you win with clients. And what I stumbled upon was a research article in 2000 and I think it was 2013. I stumbled upon a research article that came from the UK, and I believe it was posted by Alberto Nunez, and it was a 72-hour refeed study. Okay, so obviously taking calories, increasing them to caloric maintenance level, whatever perceived caloric maintenance level was at the time, and they ran this for 72 hours. And what they saw within a female clientele, was that luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone had actually increased over the course of 72 hours, even following a caloric deficit. So looking at it, reviewing the research study, highlighting everything, I basically created a plan of action to start to implement this with a lot of my female clients. Now, I had no idea at the time because back then I was working predominantly with male bodybuilders and that was it. But now I'd say about 75% of my audience is female. So I utilize these modalities every single day in working with my female clients. And what I did was I created a carb cycling approach that allowed for a 72-hour refeed and followed that by either 4 to 7 days in a caloric deficit. And the first couple of people that I experimented with it on, I had one gal lose over 50 pounds. I had another gal lose over 40 pounds. And then I had another woman that lost like 35 or 37 pounds. And that was over the course of, I don't recall how many months it was, but it was in a pretty fair amount of time. I would say faster and less stressful on the client than anything else that I had utilized previously to that time. Because again, I was working predominantly with males, and you and I both know that you could push a male pretty hard and not necessarily give him a bunch of like high carb days or diet breaks or refeeds, and he's still going to get pretty lean because obviously genetically men are designed to be leaner than females, and we don't necessarily have as many hormonal adaptations as females typically have during during the fat loss journey. So once I got those results back, I'm like, man, like, what else can I do with this? How else can I implement this? How can I make it better? You know, and for a lot of your audience who may be coaches, I would say never be fearful of experimenting with things, because in doing what we do, every single one of our clients is kind of like, we treat them like a case study, right? You can treat them as an experiment in a sense to essentially see if something works. And I started to implement these things. The results were phenomenal. So I started to tell some of the colleagues that I was associated with at the time about these things called a diet break. And again, there were some people who were like, look, you know, the top people in the business aren't using them. There's no research to really support them yet. You know, all the research on carb cycling is still very skewed. And I'm like, all right, well, I'm just going to tell you guys like what I found, and you know, you can choose to use them or not. So I continue to use them. But as I continued to use them, I started to develop this idea that there was an applied stress with every single time I would increase volume in a training program or decrease calories with a nutrition program, or a client was going through a stressful time in life or with work or with a relationship or whatever. And I started to view this whole thing as like a balancing game. So I've made an infographic about this on my Instagram, but I really feel like fat loss, especially for females, is really a balancing act. So what I essentially started to do back then was I started to take these diet breaks, which I guess we could categorize them as a 72-hour refeed to be like kind of like a diet break, but a diet break would be a longer period of time. I'd say anywhere from 5, 7 up to maybe 14 days or longer. And I started to increase the duration of the break. So I started to increase that to 4 days, and people were saying, oh, I feel even better. I'm like, really? That's interesting. Yeah. So the biofeedback was coming back very positive. And I increased it to 5 days. And they're like, oh, I feel even better now, coach. Like, I'm like, all right, well, like, I'm just going to give them a whole week. Like, just give them a whole week to kind of reset things. And then I had to take a step back and I had to think about why I was actually using it. And I played sports my entire life, just like I said in the beginning of the podcast. And every single sport that I ever played, you had quarters of the game and you had a halftime, right? However, at the time, nobody was treating a bodybuilding preparation like a game for sports. It was just a constant caloric deficit. Maybe you have some high days here or there. Maybe you have 24-hour refeed once a week. People that kind of caught on, they were doing maybe 2 refeed days per week, but nobody was really using a diet break. And the way that I would do it was I would say, all right, we're going to carb cycle for, if it was a 16-week prep or a 20-week prep, we're going to carb cycle for the first 8 weeks. We're going to see what we can get out of the first 8 weeks. Then we're going to use a diet break for a solid week. And then we're going to finish the prep strong. So essentially what I feel like the diet break was allowing people to do was not only reset physiologically, but reset psychologically. So, with regards to refilling muscle glycogen, refilling liver glycogen, reestablishing your psychological disposition in thinking about the competition preparation, utilizing a deload phase during the diet break to, again, kind of help take some of that stress off of the system. My clients started getting leaner than ever. I had bodybuilders going into shows with striated glutes and the whole nine, and I think that year we turned over a dozen people pro. And I was like, all right, they're showing up leaner than they were the previous 3 years. There's something here. So I stuck with that for a lot of my physique athletes moving forward. And it was essentially just taking a concept that was a 72-hour refeed and pretty much doubling that over and finding an application for it in saying that, hey, we're going to diet for 8 weeks, and then we're going to use this week-long diet break in the middle, and then we're going to finish the fat loss phase with another 8 weeks. Now, since then, my application of that has obviously grown and then it's expanded. The Matador study came out. Dr. Bill Campbell has done extensive research on 48-hour refeeds. So there's a lot of things that are coming out now, and it really brings me a lot of joy and happiness to know, like, we started using these a long time ago, and now they're finally starting to catch light. So I'm actually happy that a lot of people's clients are actually seeing the benefit of utilizing a diet break, because it's something that I've been utilizing for so long. And a lot of our clients have just, excelled with them immensely.
No, and we can see it on your social media and the proof that you actually put in there as well. So, and I think that's pretty powerful. Now, when we're talking a lot about physique athletes and competitors, but I feel like obviously this has also transcended into the general population, and I love the reference you made, because I always talk a lot about this as athletes, like the periodization that they actually go through on a yearly basis, and they don't see it, but then like coaches and people like are usually applying some sort of periodization in their training. Now like dietitians are actually doing it in their nutrition as well. But a lot of these like concepts of diet breaks is increases in calories that are kind of like structured in a very smart way, have been like getting transcending into more like the general population, and now they're starting to implement it. And I guess like my question for you is like, do you do this with the average Joe, like the 9-to-5 people that are just trying to get leaner but they're struggling and all these different things, and how do you implement it, or how do you kind of apply it?
Right, absolutely. So I completely agree with you about the concept of nutritional periodization. Obviously, I come from like a powerlifting background, and we would always periodize everything with training, but nobody had ever looked that far into the future in regards to creating a long-term, like a year, 18-month-long plan of action for a client. And when you're capable of doing that, right, like every nutritionist that's listening to this, every client that's listening to this, they know that if they were being educated or if they were applying education into their client, the client's going to adhere to the program much better, because you're essentially standing in front of them on a dark walkway with a flashlight. You're guiding their direction, right? And most coaches, they do the complete opposite, and they put you on a dark path, and they're just like, walk forward. It's like,
let me know what you run into.
Yeah, like, I don't know where I'm going. What do you mean? And so I guess where it started to really make sense to me, because again, I've been doing it for so long, where it started to make sense to me was with that first gal that I utilized diet breaks on, and she lost 50 pounds. And that to me brought me just as much joy and satisfaction as I got from watching a client turn pro in physique athletics. So I actually now work more predominantly with the general population than I do physique athletes. And it's been very interesting to see kind of how that's transitioned over time. But I think the more I've kind of gotten away from physique athletics, and the more I've gotten away from being a bodybuilder myself, the more I kind of, I guess, relate to that general population, or somebody who has multiple children. I'm a father, I have 4 kids, and really all I strive to do now is to be able to lead with education, to provide my clients the value that they need, the education that they need, to be able to control their metabolism for the rest of their life. And the way that I saw this being applicable was, and I'll talk about a case study because it's probably one of the most, I guess, gratifying experiences that I've ever had as a coach. I started with a female client who was about 280 some pounds when we started. Okay. And for your audience, she had already lost 90 to 100 pounds all by herself, and then gained it all right back, plus an additional amount. Right. And I started dieting her, And we start talking a lot about the mindset of who she needs to be able to become, or who she needs to be able to identify as when we actually get to that place. Like when you get to the point where we've lost that weight again, it's very important that you no longer identify as being the 280-pound woman that you are now. It's very important that you start to identify as being the healthy, the goal seeking, the wake up early, the morning routine type of person that will basically allow this to stay. And I was been dieting her already for about 2 or 3 months, and we were utilizing carbohydrate cycling because obviously somebody like that, they just have a lot more weight to be able to oxidize, right? So they have a lot more fat that's capable of oxidation, even if you put them in a caloric deficit. And they may or may not need as many high carbohydrate days as somebody who's on the leaner side. But for compliance purposes, I did schedule in usually about 3 high days, maybe every 7 days. So we were doing 7 low days followed by 3 high days, 7 low days, 3 high days. And 3 months into working with her, the Matador study came out. And it was the study pretty much based around obese men, and it had 2 weeks in caloric restriction and 2 weeks at caloric maintenance. And obviously, to me, because I'd been using diet breaks for so long, I'm like, holy cow, this is phenomenal. I love it.
Here's the evidence. Yeah.
Right? Like, what's the application? How can I extend? How can I better what I've been doing for the last 5 years? And so what I did was I decided to kind of manipulate the study a little bit, because obviously, like, what's the fun in just executing it perfectly? Like, I wanted to see if there was something I could do different. So I started to implement diet breaks that were between 1 and 2 weeks long, and then diet phases that were between usually 1 to 3 weeks. But I just kind of adjusted them based on how she responded. And over the course of time, what the diet breaks essentially allowed us to do with this specific client, and a lot of your RDs will probably think this is super awesome, but what this essentially allowed us to do with the client was every time she would lose a tangible amount of weight, something that she could see, something she could feel, we did use the diet break. And what happened over the diet break, we obviously are increasing calories by anywhere from 350, 400, 450 calories. We're basically cutting her expenditure in half, and she's preserving her body weight. So it happened every single time we would lose like 20 pounds. Started at 280, boom, 260, 250. Then when we started to implement them there, got down to like 220, we implemented it. And she's like, I don't understand. I'm eating more food. I'm doing less activity. Why am I not gaining weight? So basically what we were doing the entire time was I was teaching her how to preserve her new body weight. Every single time we used the break, she could preserve 220, 200, 180, 170, 160, 150. And now here we are at 140 pounds. She's literally lost half her body from when she started. And we've increased calories again, upwards of 400 plus calories, taken some of the exercise away, and she is preserving 140 to 145 pounds and has been for the last 3 or 4 months.
Dude, that's insane. And it's crazy to think about that too, because I was just having a conversation with one of my clients who she has been battling with the weight loss. She has been kind of struggling in so many different ways. And she went on this like week vacation. It was like a mission trip. And she actually like stopped training, stopped exercising, because she was just kind of doing this stuff. She would spend actually like 8 hours in a car because they were doing like driving to remote areas. And she actually started to see the scale move after she got back. And I was like, what does that tell you? You gave your body the break that it kind of needed in some way. We increased her calories during that time. And then she's just like, what's going on? So it's literally like what you're kind of like saying, like it's kind of like giving your body that breather that it needs. You need like physiological break. That's the kind of way that you would describe in some way, shape, or form the diet break, correct?
I would describe it as a psychological and physiological break in the applied stress that basically allows you to return back to a balanced state.
Yeah.
So our bodies always will respond better when they're not under high levels of stress. And again, the reason why I have this kind of scale idea is essentially because if I put you into a caloric deficit for a long period of time, let's say you're already somewhat lean or athletic, and I jack your cardio up, there's only so many rocks I can throw on one side of the scale before you're completely tipped and you're out of balance. So then therefore we have to actually take some time and say, all right, well, if I actually want to continue to go past this, because everybody who does that, they always plateau, right? I'm sure every single person who's listening to this, they've plateaued in some form or fashion over the last 5-10 years, right? And they're like, why am I plateauing? Well, it's because you've applied so much stress that your system isn't capable of oxidizing any more body fat. So then we can essentially go into talking about hormonal adaptations and metabolic adaptation, if that's something you want to, Andreas.
Yeah, we can, man. I would love to.
So a lot of the time, what I was noticing was that people were coming to me with a previous history of utilizing a low carbohydrate diet, low calorie diet, and they are just hitting these plateaus to where their weight loss is not moving down at all. Psychologically, they're just in a really bad position. This is typically where we see people kind of like standing on the tip of an iceberg, you know, and they're like, maybe I'm going to binge, maybe I'm not, maybe this isn't worth it, maybe it is. Should I keep going to the gym and doing all this cardio? Should I keep killing myself in the gym? But they don't necessarily have any other option because they've been taught their entire lives, both in society, from their trainers, so on and so forth, that you just got to grind through it. You just got to keep pushing. If you plateau, you got to drop calories even more. If you plateau with cardio, you got to increase cardio. And that is the completely wrong way to look at it, at least in my opinion. If you look at this from a physiological perspective, and we understand a little bit about hormones, I'll give you guys a real quick crash course on hormonal adaptations and how metabolic adaptation actually happens. So glucose in most cases controls leptin, right? Now, most people, when they want to lose body fat, they will reduce glucose or carbohydrates, whether that be the fads that are out saying that, hey, you can't lose body fat if you eat fruit, right? You can't lose body fat if you eat rice or whatever it is. And the truth behind that is that fructose actually refills liver glycogen, right? And then complex carbohydrate sources actually refill muscular glycogen. And leptin basically fuels your thyroid's ability to be optimized or suppressed. So as an example, when we're having these breaks, we're having increased levels of carbohydrate coming from either a diet break, multiple day refeed. What's essentially happening is that those carbohydrates are breaking down into glucose. That glucose is then increasing leptin serum. That leptin serum sends a signal to your pituitary gland. And then the pituitary gland sends a signal to your thyroid, basically telling you how many calories you're capable of oxidizing or how many calories you're capable of expending on that day because you've given your body more fuel. Now, when you're on these low-calorie diets, your thyroid's ability to burn more calories is very suppressed. It doesn't turn off. It doesn't like shut down to the point you can't do anything, but it will make it very, very hard for you to A, feel good psychologically or physiologically, and B, just not have any energy to actually preserve muscle when you're in the gym training. So these diet breaks basically fuel your thyroid and they allow you to have more energy. They allow you to keep more muscle. They allow you to keep your resting metabolic rate higher. They allow you to keep the thermic effect of food higher. They allow you to keep your non-exercise activity thermogenesis higher. They allow you to keep your total daily energy expenditure higher. It just allows every single metabolic process, which
to be optimized.
Yeah, to be optimized. And I know that most people don't necessarily know what metabolism is, but basically it's every single physiological process in your entire body. Every single process. So when you reduce calories, you are essentially becoming less healthy in most cases. Now, there is a place where, you know, obviously if you're overweight, you lose weight, you're going to improve health markers. But to a point of like somebody who wants to get excessively lean, as you diet down, in most cases, your metabolism just becomes more efficient. And we actually want to live more in a land of being more inefficient so that we're burning less calories. We're burning more calories doing the same activities.
That's crazy because a lot of times like people think of also like the carbohydrates and they don't really look at all the stuff that kind of goes behind it. Now, just for people listening in so they understand the definitions that exist in those specific hormones. So can you briefly explain like leptin and it's basically its like main role in the body, and then also thyroid hormones, because a lot of people sometimes like blame their problems. I'm like, I probably have an underactive thyroid, or I may have like a thyroid problem. And I think a lot of people, when they listen to that part that you just mentioned, they're like, oh, like makes perfect sense because technically thyroid kind of controls like metabolic rate. So what is like the relationship that exists between them? And then maybe provide just for people listening in like a brief definition of like how those like hormones, like exactly what they are and what they do.
Yeah, sure. So there's kind of a constant back and forth relationship between leptin and ghrelin, right? So ghrelin is your hunger hormone, right? And your hunger hormone ghrelin is basically controlled by your hypothalamus, and basically it pretty much just tells your body whether or not you have enough or you do not have enough. Now I have videos up on my YouTube channel about this stuff.
We'll link it up to that. Mm-hmm.
That's just a very similar concept of being like on a scale kind of process. Hypothalamus will basically tell your body if you have eaten, you have enough. If you have not eaten, you do not have enough. Now, where leptin plays a role in that is if you have not eaten enough for a prolonged period of time, the actual leptin serum will start to decrease. As that leptin serum decreases, that signal is then sent to the pituitary and sent to the thyroid, which regulates how many calories you're capable of expending. So this will make a lot of sense to a lot of the listeners. But if you've been on a low-calorie diet, doing a lot of cardio for, let's say, a couple of months on end, you'll notice that you don't really heat up the way that you used to. You'll notice that you could do cardio and it becomes harder to sweat. You'll notice that the scale likely has slowed down. So maybe when you started the deficit, you were losing weight consistently, you were feeling great, you're motivated, and then all of a sudden you hit that wall. This is where I feel like the implementation, specifically for females, the implementation of a diet break or a more strategic planned approach where we are implementing high days numerous times per week would be very beneficial, because now you're actually learning to not fear carbohydrate, but you're actually learning to utilize carbohydrate as a means to be able to continuously see fat loss in the future.
Wow. Yeah. And I think that's for people listening. And I think a lot of times, like, they just don't understand the relationship that exists, because they always kind of see like the immediate impact that their food choices are going to make. And they also don't understand exactly how to listen to their body for that purpose. And I think that's very important. Yeah. Now, one thing that you mentioned earlier though about, and I think this is the part of it that I want to talk, like a word that you use, which is actually compliance, when it comes down to everything on here, because here's what I sometimes, and a lot of times, like maybe like some coaches and dietitians also listening to this, like they may experience this problem with, which is actually like, implementing some of these strategies like diet breaks, refeeds, carb cycling, all kinds of stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But how do we know, or how do we actually know this is effective when the compliance may not be 90, 95, 100%? And how do you deal with that? Right.
So how do we optimize compliance? And I think that's the big question. I know historically a lot of registered dietitians or dietitians in general, were kind of taught the weight loss approach of, it's this many calories. If they stop responding, it's this many calories. You stop responding, it's this many calories. And it's kind of like a constant trickle down effect, to the point where you get them to a point where they're eating low calories and it's very hard for them to adhere to the program. And I think at that moment in time, we have to take a step back and we have to check our tool belt, and we have to say, what tools do I have to actually be able to improve compliance with this person? Because they've been drastically going down in calories for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 months on end. Have they lost weight? Yeah, absolutely. Do they feel better about themselves? Yeah. But are they also reporting back to me through their biofeedback that they're having problems adhering to the plan? And this is where we take a step back, we look at our tool belt and we say, what tools do I have where I can actually apply them to this specific scenario? Now, again, I talk a lot about case studies because I have gathered a lot of data from a lot of my clients over the last 9.5 years. And I think that's probably the best way that I can correlate this. So the other day, I got an email from one of my clients, and she's been in a fat loss phase, having 2 high carb days per week on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday through Friday are low carbohydrate days. And she's lost about 10 pounds or so. I get an email from her. She's frantic, right? William, I'm so stressed out. Blah, 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 blah. I just can't do this anymore. Monday through Friday, it's too hard. And I'm like, when can we talk? We need to get on the phone as soon as possible. She's like, Monday. I'm like, all right, great. So that was a Saturday. We talked on Monday morning. And what I essentially got out of her was that she has some life stresses that are accumulating. And most people, because of their life stresses, right, they try to find some level of comfort. And most of us, we are taught comfort by the way that we are fed as we're children, right? So as a baby, you start crying, mom shoves a bottle in your face and you're quiet, you're fine. As a young kid, if your blood sugar drops, parent might throw a pack of fruit snacks at you and be like, hey, elevate your blood sugar, you'll be fine, right? And like we see this like joy within eating things. And I think that's kind of where that comes from, is just we find satisfaction in being able to eat things freely because it's a comfort measure. And this is exactly where this client was she was right there. You know, she's a single mom. She has 2 kids. She drives them around all day long. She homeschools them. She does the whole 9. And I could tell that she was frantic. And I had a conversation with her, just like me and you are having here on video. And I asked her, I'm like, what's going on? You know, she's like, my husband isn't here. My husband's been away for a week. You know, I got my kids doing all these different sports and I'm trying to make everything happen at home. And she was on the verge of binging because she was so stressed out, right? So I immediately say, we're going to adjust. We're going to implement a 7-day diet break effective right now. I asked her then, are you checking your weight every day? She says, yes. I said, how do you feel psychologically? And how does that time when you're checking your weight, how does that actually affect your psychology for that whole day? She says, oh my God, it puts me in the most terrible mood if I don't lose weight. We're pulling that out too. So now I'm not having her check her weight for a whole week. I'm increasing her calories by, it was probably for her at least 400. And then, you know, we took some of her training volume out and I cut her cardio in half. And I said, what I want you to do for me is I want you to sit down in your chair right in front of me while I have you here on this call. And I want you to write down on a piece of paper how you feel with these specific topics. And it was, how's your energy? Psychologically, what is your mood like? How's your strength in the gym? And then, you know, what's your outlook when you actually wake up in the morning? She writes it all down. And I said, let's schedule another call for a week. And she says, okay. So we just talked the other day and I had her pull out that same piece of paper and we went through it again. And I had her write down how she's feeling now. Complete night and day difference, right? And the thing is that, you know, you can put somebody in a caloric deficit. You can keep them there for a while if that's what you choose to do. But if you understand the physiology and how the hormones work and what I just explained about leptin, ghrelin, thyroid, and all of that, you probably wouldn't keep them there just because it doesn't make sense for the long term. If you're forcing an adaptation over a short period of time, does it make sense to keep somebody in a chronic caloric deficit? Yeah. But does that actually set them up for a lifelong of success? I don't think it does, because they're then placed in a position where they don't have tools on their belt to where, say, if shit hits the fan, what am I going to do? You know? And then they can think back to that time I worked with William, shit hit the fan, I pulled out a diet break and I preserved my weight. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because I think like people start to see nutrition as just like, you know, the food that they consume and exactly the effect that it's going to cause without necessarily like looking at the context and the environment that is being placed upon. And I think you mentioned something very impactful, which is something I always emphasize along with my clients, which is, you know, the historical and the relationship that always existed with food since you were a child. And you have obviously all these people that have like this like terrible relationship with food because of the fact that it comes from a background that, you know, precedes it. And, you know, and I tell a lot of people like, I grew up in an environment in which like food for me, which is like, we never talked about dieting. We never talked about that kind of stuff. Food was just something, it was there. My mom always kind of focused on fueling us the way it was, you know, it was supposed to kind of like to feed our needs. And it's crazy to think how some people are sometimes like they start to kind of like get into these kind of stressful situations in which food revolve, like, you know, basically becomes like their safe way in some way, shape, or form. So, but I think obviously looking at those like biofeedback mechanisms like stress and energy and all these different things, I think obviously makes like a bigger impact in the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think with general population clients as well, you know, the more you can educate them and the more tools you can provide them so that they can actually learn how to apply those tools when they're actually set free and on their own, the more power you're giving them, so that when the stuff happens in the future and they're not with you, they know how to respond. And I feel like this is how we can create a world full of educated dieters, because, you know, I don't know if any of you guys, you know, like are watching what's happening in the world right now, but like the world is heavier than it's ever been. And like there's more processed foods out in the world than there's ever been. There's more diets than there's ever been. And, you know, I think that, you know, utilizing modalities similar to what Andreas uses and I use, that's really the way that we can lead with education and actually, you know, change the future of maybe the next 5, 10, 20 years, you know?
Yeah, I think that's Pretty fascinating, dude. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, but I also wanted to kind of finish up on a last note, which I just wanted to talk about also, like the whole concept of, we talked about compliance, but also you obviously going to have, and you're going to run to some people that sometimes they say they are compliant and they are reflecting and tell you that they're compliant, but obviously there's something not happening. And when you go into like this, like I'm fine, energy and stuff like that, obviously they're just kind of suppressing some of the stuff that may be happening. Do you ever encounter issues with underreporting, for example? Like whenever you have like issues like, you know what, like I'm actually like, I'm doing everything you do, I'm doing the macros that you told me and all kinds of stuff like that, but it's not reflecting on other kinds of things that may be happening, and how you kind of approach the situations with those?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll try to make this pretty short and sweet, because I know you also wanted to talk about the fast and that kind of stuff. But with that, I have a tendency to believe internally that when I develop a relationship with a client, we both mutually are on the same team. You've told me what your goal is. Now it's my opportunity to make sure that you comply with what that goal is, and all of your actions fit what that goal is. So I would say that it's not necessarily like a malicious thing to where they're under tracking on purpose, but actually to where we just kind of stumble upon things and we're like, oh, you weren't tracking that. Like, as an example, I had a male client, he was stuck around like 155. And I asked him, I'm like, hey, can you just send me your stuff? Because looking at the data and looking at the numbers just kind of doesn't make sense. And he sends me all of his data. I take a look at it. Come to find out, he's using like 4 tablespoons of olive oil every day when that he wasn't tracking. Because for him, being an Italian guy, he grew up olive oil on everything, right? So we basically found that out. And I'm like, dude, you've been using 4 tablespoons of olive oil. If we break that down, that's like, 30 grams of fat. And 30 grams of fat is almost 300 calories. So we essentially swapped that out for olive oil cooking spray. And then he dropped another 5 pounds over the next three weeks, So I don't think that it's like a malicious thing to where they're like under reporting, but I'm very good at paying attention to the details. And if they are, or at least I feel like maybe they're not being honest with me, I have a call just like this, like face to face, because it's very hard to, I mean, if I can see you, like it's hard for you to lie,
Yeah.
As equally as it is for anybody. Like if I can actually sit there and I can ask you questions, we can dig a little bit deeper. I'll typically find out the answer. So I think that if you are a client or you are a coach and you feel that at any point in time, it does you no service to just sweep it under the rug. If you ever feel like maybe they're not being open and honest with you, nip that thing in the butt like as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's good, man. Because I think a lot of people listening in, they're gonna be like, oh yeah, especially if they're clients of mine or they're clients of any kind of like dietitians listening in, or if you're a coach, you're probably gonna have to you're gonna like reflect on this a lot. So I think that's pretty powerful. Yeah. I wanted to ask and finish this up with an experiment that you did very recently, and I love, because I literally like watch all your stories and some of this stuff on here. So you did and I've talked about fasting before, but you did a 72-hour 4-day fasting experiment. Tell us about that, and why did you do it?
Sure. So, it started out as a 72, and then I pushed it to 96. So I went 4 days. But it wasn't, I didn't plan on doing that because and I think it's important to talk about the mental perception of how I was before I did it, and then kind of how I got the benefit from it. So psychologically, if anybody who's listening to this, in their mind, they're probably like, holy shit, he didn't eat for 4 days. And that was my approach too. I'm like, am I actually going to do this? Like, this is just weird. Like, I'm a bodybuilder. I have to eat. I have to build muscle, like, and all that stuff. And that was my position. And everybody that I told I was going to do it, even like my wife and my kids, are like, oh, that's crazy. Like, I don't understand that. So for me, I'm like, all right, I'm going to do this because everybody thinks it's crazy. And I want to actually learn more about my body. So as a background, everybody in my family is overweight. Okay. And historically, they always have been. So genetically high blood sugar actually runs in my family. So even when I'm very lean, or even if I've attempted a ketogenic diet in the past, the lowest my fasted blood sugar has ever gotten, since I've had the nutritional knowledge that I have now, is 83. Okay. Ever. Even on keto.
Wow.
And so I told myself, the reason that I started doing it was because I noticed that when I had higher carbohydrates, it negatively impacted my brain, how I was capable of processing thoughts, how clearly I spoke. And I had a speech impediment my entire life. And whenever my blood sugar starts to go out of whack, I notice that I start to stutter more. Okay. So essentially what I wanted to do was see how low can I get my fasted blood sugar? Because when my fasted blood sugar is low, I'm crystal clear, right? So that's how it started out. Checked my blood sugar on day one in a fasted state, completely fasted, and it was 106. Okay. So I started doing this fast, and the first day, the first 24 hours really wasn't that hard. What essentially happened for me, though, was that I was placed in an environment where other people were eating. And that's when like the habits came back, and they're like, everybody else is eating. Shouldn't you be eating too? And like my wife had stopped at Publix, and she had gotten my kids all the foods that I like the chicken tenders and like all that stuff. And I'm like, man, like I just want to eat. But it wasn't because I was actually physically hungry and knew I needed to eat. It was just because habitually I always ate at noon. I always ate at 4. I always eat at 8. And then I eat before I go to bed. So that first day was probably the hardest. But the thing that made it the hardest was that it was a habit, and I had to break the habit, So very similarly to how people reach for food to, comfort themselves, how a smoker would kind of reach for a cigarette, how an alcoholic would reach for a shot. Like, I really feel that there are people who have this clinical diagnosis to where they just reach for food. And, obviously eating disorders are a very widespread epidemic, and I feel for everybody who has ever had one. But this experience for me was very eye-opening. So we go into day 2, and the most extreme hunger I've ever experienced. Granted, I've competed in bodybuilding like 8 times. I've dieted for 20 weeks in a row. This was the most extreme hunger I'd ever had, and it was at hour like 40 to hour 48. However, what I noticed in day 2 was that I was so much more cognitively aware, so much more focused. Thoughts came to me clearer. I could read better. I could respond to emails better because I wasn't focused on doing anything else. I was just so locked into what I was doing because food was no longer an option. So I had to find something else to do to fill the time that I would have normally ate. I got more work done in them 3 days, dude, than I've probably gotten done in a long time. But it was because I eliminated every distraction, and I focused on what I was doing, and I eliminated that thought that I needed to eat. From that point, after 48 hours, again, pretty intense hunger. But again, I had to block that out. On day 3, when I woke up, I felt like my body was just under so much less stress. I felt like any inflammation that I had that was causing me any aches or pains in my joints, my shoulders, my elbows, my knees, my hips, wherever, it was gone. And I felt the adaptation happen to where I was just very relaxed, very calm, cool, and collected. There wasn't really anything that spiked my energy. There really wasn't anything that brought my energy down. It was more like I was in complete control of how I physically acted, how I was physically responding to things, and just my overall like state of well-being within the world. So like very low stress, calm, cool, collected, super chill, super clear in my mind. And that was when I got like my first like real benefit, at least I felt, from it.
What was your fasting blood sugar then?
It got down to 75 within the first 72 hours, it hit 75. So it was the lowest that it had ever gotten over the course of 3 days. So what's the application for that? I started to think about it, and I'm like, man, like there's research out about type 2 insulin diabetics, right, who reduce their carbohydrate intake or go on a ketogenic approach, and they walk for a half an hour a day, and they're able to not be type 2 diabetic any longer over the course of a few weeks. I'm like, man, like what's the application of this? Could we actually save people's lives if more people just started to implement this type of fast, or like a more of a low carbohydrate approach with what we know on the back end in regards to utilizing carbohydrates as a modality for compliance, right?
Yeah.
And so there's all these ideas running through my mind, but that was the main thing, was because everybody in my family is overweight. Yeah. So I'm like, could I improve their fasted blood sugar, and help them not be overweight anymore, which is eventually what I did with my mom, but I'm kind of getting off topic here. And on day 4, hunger was completely gone.
It was like a switch, right?
It was there literally was a light switch. You could have put any type of food in front of me. I didn't want to eat it. It became to the point where I was so prideful in the fact that I hadn't eaten for 3.5 days that I actually wanted to stretch the fast for 7 days or longer. And I was like, is the feeling of me wanting to break my fast just because I'm being weak within this moment? Or is it, is this like the second level to get to the next level? And I had to sit down for like an hour and I thought about it. And what I reflected on was that I had gotten everything I wanted to get out of the fast. And that continuing to fast wasn't going to benefit me for my future of trying to build muscle and, go into a fat loss phase in 2020 and all of that. So I eventually called the fast off. But I guess the key things that I wanted to highlight there in regards to the fast was that fasted blood sugar went from 106 to 75 in 3 days. I didn't do any exercise while I was fasting other than walking. I feel like exercise compounding on top of fasting would essentially just lead you to a place where now you're in this, you're in a high stress environment. That high stress environment may negatively impact the fast. The other thing was that I had an extreme sense of gratitude for just being able to live the lifestyle that I lived for 30 years before I fasted. Because a lot of us, we live this lifestyle of being able to eat the healthiest food in the world and eat all these amazing foods that in the third world country, they would never experience that in their whole life. There's people and there's children in the world that get a little handful of rice every day. Right?
Yeah, man. I'm from Venezuela, so it's the kind of things that you see every day.
And so I reflected back to my time being a physique athlete and reflected back to all the athletes that I've helped and how they're always telling me, Coach, I'm so hungry, I'm hangry and all this. And I'm like, dude, you have no idea. I had no idea until I did the fast. So again, an extreme sense of gratitude for just being able to eat the foods that I eat. And those are probably the main things that I got out of the fast was, the blood sugar, the gratitude, the feeling of being able to overcome hunger, not feeling like hunger controlled me any longer.
The psychological change that you experienced as a result of that.
It was a lot, man. It was a lot, but I'm very grateful for the experience. If I ever chose to do it again, I would definitely try to remove any life stress or work stress out of my life and just kind of meditate and just be and read and just, be as removed from anything that could cause me stress as possible.
Yeah, and when you look at the religious, I study fasting a lot. It's one of the areas I'm super interested in. And when you look at the religious backgrounds and religious historical backgrounds on specific things, it's all related to that. Fasts were always kind of related and associated with times of selfless and times of meditation, times of being present. And I think obviously that's why that's the best way to do it. So that's really good, man. I mean, I love hearing this because I've done fasting before, 48 hours. Nothing extending past that, but it's something to give a lot of people to think about. Now, is this something that you would recommend anybody to just go out and do, or it requires supervision, or this is something that requires some level of? Because I don't want people listening to this okay, I'm gonna go out in here and stop eating for 4 days.
Yeah, and I probably should have prefaced that before I started talking about all the benefits and how amazing I felt. But in all honesty, I think that there is a practical application for it. But I think that it should absolutely be supervised in some form or fashion. You have to understand that I have been involved in nutrition for the last 14 years in some form or fashion. I understood that I had to make sure that I prioritized hydration, made sure that I prioritized electrolytes, vitamins and minerals, all of those things. So I wouldn't advise somebody just going into it all by themselves. I would actually advise them to seek some level of professional help. But the application of it, definitely in regards to the records that I was able to gather through my fasted blood sugar, could definitely have application for specific types of people, specifically probably type 2 diabetics or anybody with insulin resistance.
Nice. That's good.
You know?
Well, like definitely we're gonna be talking a lot more about that because I feel like it's a really interesting topic to cover and you know, the science of fasting and hunger control. I think there's a lot of applications that we can kind of see in the future.
Absolutely.
Dude, like this is being awesome. The only thing I like to do at the end of the podcast is just some quick rapid fire questions just to wrap it up and just to kind of like, you know, something fun. And then you can tell us a little more people about how they can find you. First question, it'll be a quick one. What's your favorite exercise? You have a pretty big gym in the garage. I know that.
Man, the most bang for your buck, if you can execute it properly, I'd probably say the conventional deadlift.
Yeah, that's a typical one, especially like, you know, science and exercise science gurus. So definitely do that. Second question would be, what is a book that everybody should have on their bookshelves?
The Power of Self-Confidence by Brian Tracy.
Good. All right. I have actually read that book, but I always kind of write them down also for myself because I like to actually have a good one. A podcast or YouTube channel, definitely you can plug in yours as well, that, you know, you would recommend people listen to or watch for just nutrition education. Nutrition
education, a podcast that has probably the most researchers on it, the most people with the most kind of in-depth thought processes, I'd probably say is like Revive Stronger.
Yeah,
Steve. Steve Hall does a phenomenal job bringing on like the top experts in the world.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're talking about people like Eric Helms, Lane Norton, Enel Henselmans, you know, Greg Knuckles, Zordos, like all those guys. You know, there's a lot of people that have been on that podcast. And if you go through all of his podcasts, you could basically, you could acquire years of knowledge and experience in a very short period of time. So I would say Steve Hall's Revive Stronger podcast. Another person I would recommend, who's doing a phenomenal job, and I obviously respect him because he crushes his content, is Cody Boom Boom.
Oh, dude, yeah. He's been on the podcast before, yeah. Dude,
he puts content out like it's nobody's business, you know? So just out of respect for what he's doing within our space, I will tag him here as well. And those are probably the two that I would say. Yeah, I mean, 3DMJ, they do a great job too. Yeah, those would probably be the top three.
Sweet. That's awesome. We're gonna make sure we link to those in the show notes as well. Last question would be, this is the funnest one. If you were stranded on a desert for the rest of your life, like a desertic island, and you were to choose one food to live off of until the end of your days, what would that be?
One food?
One food.
However I answer this, it's going to be wrong because you're going to have
there's always going to be like the analytical side of you is going to be like, you know, choose like the most nutrition option, and then there's going to be like the child of you, which is going to choose the one that makes you happiest.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, I would probably if I'm stranded on a deserted island, I'm probably not going to be that involved in fitness because I'm going to be so active trying to live. So I would say, like, being a true Floridian, like if I had just like a couple really amazing orange trees on the island, I probably.
There you go. That's a good one. That's good. Awesome. Cool, man. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast. How can people find you, reach out to you, check out your content, have a conversation with you? What's the best way to do that?
Sure, man. Yeah, obviously, I really appreciate you having me on, but you guys can find me on Instagram at William_Grazione. I'm on LinkedIn, William Grazione. I'm on Twitter, William Grazione. I'm on YouTube, William Grazione. I'm on Facebook,
William Grazione everywhere.
William Grazione. William Grazione everywhere, pretty much on all the platforms, except some of the new ones that are coming out, you know, like the Snapchats and all that stuff.
Okay, that's good. So we're gonna make sure you put the link on the show notes for all that. But definitely check out Will's content. Like, it's just amazing the way that he puts out information and the knowledge that he just puts out there. So thank you so much, Will, for being here on the podcast today, man.
Thank you so much for having me on, Jay.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to another episode of VV Nutrition Radio. I wanted to ask you a quick favor. If you enjoyed this episode, or if you're enjoying the podcast altogether, make sure you subscribe and leave us a review so we increase our visibility and we continue to reach more people and change your lifestyle through nutrition, performance, fitness, and health. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys on the next one.